everyone. And on behalf of HTTP, I want to take a moment and say thank you to all of our speakers and partners who are making this event possible. Without you, we wouldn't be here today having this amazing time and opportunity. My name is Dr. Chris Wilkie, and I serve as the CEO of SHPE, the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers. SHPE is a nonprofit professional association that serves more than 13,000 Hispanics in STEM nationwide, and we're growing each year. Our main focus is to support Hispanic STEM students in completing their degrees and launching their careers in industry or academia. We know that a strong STEM identity is at the core of every successful STEM professional. And because the internet is both an avenue of information transfer, but in this case, more importantly, a platform for seeing diverse role models and promoting positive STEM identities, the importance of high-speed internet access cannot be overemphasized in its impact on fostering inclusivity in STEM. We highly value our partnership with HTTP and the prioritization of access to not only relevant technology, but also high-speed internet for all. I am so honored to be here with you and have the opportunity to introduce our last panel of the day, which will be moderated by Zaki Barzinji. He is a program director of Aspen Digital, and Zaki will be speaking with a group of Gen Z entrepreneurs and digital consultants on how tech helps and harms the Gen Z community. So with that, let's welcome Zaki and our panel.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session of the day that we're calling How Tech Helps and Harms Gen Z Communities. My name is Zaki Barzinji, and I'm a director at Aspen Digital, which is a program of the Aspen Institute that addresses the intersection of technology, policy, media, and society. My own work at Aspen Digital tends to focus on the intersection of tech and underrepresented communities. And it's in that spirit that we're very honored and excited to host this session as part of HTTP's Digital Inclusion Summit. Gen Z and tech, the topic so often talked about by policymakers, big companies, the media, concerned parents, and pearl clutchers everywhere. The questions are often the same. How do we protect kids online? How do we sell to kids? Will their future be brighter or darker? Why is TikTok evil? But also, how can I go viral on it? What's often missing from these conversations, of course, are the very people that are being talked about. Because the truth is, emerging technology is more than just a mixed bag for the rising generation. There are plenty of ways in which tech helps uplift and amplify young folks like never before, particularly those from communities that are traditionally marginalized. At the same time, there are also so many ways in which tech is actively harming the younger generations. And that harm is magnified 1,000 times more for those from marginalized communities. So to unpack these questions and highlight the lived experiences of those right at the center, Aspen Digital is partnering with Juve Consulting, which is one of the only entirely Gen Z run consulting firms today, to bring you this session. And I'm joined by 4 phenomenal young leaders with incredible backgrounds. I'll introduce all of them to you, and we will have a discussion. First up, Ziad Ahmed. Ziad is the founder and CEO of Juve Consulting. He's from Princeton, New Jersey, and is a recent graduate of Yale University, where he studied social media's impact on politics. In 2013, he founded Redefy, a nonprofit focused on creating resources to make schools more inclusive. Ziad has advised numerous organizations, politicians, and campaigns, served on nonprofit boards, and organized many different groups. He has given 4 TEDx talks, written for Teen Vogue, and spent too much time on TikTok. He was named to Forbes 30 under 30 at 19, and he has spoken everywhere from American Express to the Council on Foreign Relations to university dining halls. Gabe Garcia is the 23-year young senior director of People, Inclusion, and Accounts at Juve. They are a graduate of Northeastern University and hailing from Long Beach, California. They previously worked at Boston Consulting Group on the North America Diversity and Inclusion team, helping drive their inclusion, equity, and belonging agenda amongst staff. Prior Gabe was a Millennium Fellow, where they worked with the United Nations in academic impact to advance LGBTQ plus health outcomes, promoting and centering queer wellness and inclusive care. In their free time, Gabe is a writer of mostly poetry and a washed-up dancer who occasionally can still do the splits, which we may or may not have time to ask them about. Claire Fennell. Claire is 19 years old and an English and creative writing major at New York University. Outside of her work at Juve, she's president of the NYU debate team and a literary event marketing intern at the Center for Fiction in Brooklyn. She's passionate about iced coffee, oldies music, the need for more women in stand-up, why we should all simp for the New York Times, and why Portland isn't actually all that woke. She's also passionate about queer media theory, and in her bio asks the question, did you know that vampires are often used to code for queer love in literature and movies? It's a good question. And finally, Faith Andrews O'Neill is director of The Live at Juve. She's 19 years old, born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, and a student at Columbia University. She's a staff writer for Columbia's newspaper, The Spectator, where she covers city news. She's been recognized for her work in journalism in both high school and college, and loves to use the methods learned in journalism and to advocate for her community. As a dancer with Kansas City Friends of Alvin Ailey, she was featured on Netflix's Queer Eye and started a fine arts day camp for girls entering grades 5 to 9 in Kansas City. She's also an avid embroiderer. And that's our wonderful panel. Ziad, Gabe, Claire, Faith, thank you all so much for joining me for this conversation. Let's just get the elephant out of the room. I am indeed an ancient, creaky old millennial. And I feel like it was literally just yesterday that I was hearing all about how my generation was the me generation. We were the kids hopelessly lost in their phones and devices, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like I have both equal parts relief and sympathy for the fact that Gen Z has now moved under the microscope. And now everyone is trying to dissect and explain you as though you're wild lab experiments. So let me just start with like the most basic question. In one word, how does it feel to be a Gen Zer right now?
I would start by saying anxiety inducing. I think you nailed it on the head when you said there are a lot of people trying to like poke and prod and understand us. And that's kind of where Juve's ethos comes from. In a sense, like a lot of those people are not Gen Zers themselves. And so our fundamental and core belief here is if you want to understand and reach young people, you actually have to talk to them and give them a seat at the table. And so I would say anxiety inducing because, you know, we're still really pushing to get those seats at the table or flip the table, as we also say here.
Yeah, kind of in a similar vein to Gabe, I think I would say overwhelming, kind of beyond just like the purely anxiety inducing, like there's so much going on in the world. There's also a huge sort of onus on Gen Z to do just a million and one things all the time, both to like advocate for the causes that we're passionate about, like in our day-to-day lives, to, you know, enter the professional world as we're kind of in our like coming of age eras. And I think all of these sorts of pressures and expectations kind of get romanticized, right? Like we're the generation that fights for change, but like that's also exhausting. So I think that there's just this like total culture of feeling overwhelmed that's within our generation that I think kind of generates the anxiety that Gabe is talking about. And yeah, I think they're right on the nose.
Yeah, I think speaking to Claire's point about the pressure, I think the first word that came to mind for me was informative. Like, I think we have so much access through social media and being like the digital generation to so much information. And it can be incredibly overwhelming at times as we are constantly inundated with like every global and domestic and local crisis that is happening at any given time. But in that, I think also being in a position of privilege to be able to attend an institution such as Columbia, I'm also able to like use sort of all of that information and engage in discourse with my peers and then go home and tell my grandma, like, that says abc.co, not .com, like, don't click on that website. That's not real news. So it's obviously overwhelming to be able to take in all that information, but also kind of having the opportunity to disseminate that information has been something that I think is really cool about Gen Z in particular.
My word is blender. It's not an adjective, it's a noun. And the reason it's blender is I often visualize myself as being in a blender without the cap on, at full speed. And that's how I feel like what synthesizes the Gen Z experience in some ways, for me at least. It's this idea of constantly being whirled around. And I think there's a lot of whiplash in regards to trends and in regards to, what we feel like we have permission to do or to say or to be. But also that there's sort of no ceiling, right? And on one hand, like that's an enormous opportunity and like, is it deeply empowering? On the other hand, it's like a damn mess, right? And like quite literally means that like we're splashing everywhere constantly, sort of without any end in sight, right? And so I certainly resonate with this idea of us being this anxious, overwhelmed generation that is also using information as a source of power, right? But with any power comes risk, right? And I think that we are living, and breathing that day in and day out.
Those are all excellent questions, and even more profound than I was hoping with such a simple prompt. So let's drill in a little bit. I mean, you all have all identified kind of this somewhat of a dichotomy, binary, although it's not really a binary. It's non-binary in terms of issues, which is that there's both the the opportunity that's presented more than ever especially by technology, and there's also more risks than ever before. Let's start with opportunity. I mean, what is making you most hopeful, most excited about both the present and the future when you think about technology in your generation? What are some big examples that make you hopeful and excited? And when it comes to especially, let's just say that I think all of you either come from or identify with communities that could be considered marginalized or at the margins in some way or another. Specifically for the communities that maybe you identify with or that you come from, what's making you hopeful about your generation and technology?
I think for me as a Black femme, and like I'm cis, and like just the existence of Black women, whether that is like Black trans women, Black femmes, Black cisgendered women, having the opportunity to kind of congregate very deliberately is something that I think throughout history has been like a strength of that community. But I think digitally, seeing Black women on the forefront of so many digital movements to kind of work against the algorithm that actively suppresses our voice has been something that's really inspiring for me to see, like knowing that despite the fact that like large media corporations don't necessarily want to see people that look like me on the forefront of their platforms, there are women and femmes doing the work every day to ensure that that's not the case. So from growing up in middle school and like the blackout movement on Tumblr, which was just like every Black person posts a selfie today, and that was all that it was. And just being able to see just like Black faces throughout my feed in sixth grade, like scrolling on my school given iPad, to now seeing the same thing on TikTok when everyone, is changing their profile pictures to the Black Lives Matter fest. And we were told, like, especially on my feed, there was like one day and it was like on this day, like only like and engage with Black women's content just to see like what the algorithm will do. And then for like the next 2 days, which doesn't seem like a long time, but on TikTok is like 10 years, basically, my feed was just so flush with Black women and femmes and Black queer voices. And it was just very inspiring to see the ways in which we have been able to kind of adapt to modern times, whether that's like finding community in quarantine or dealing with like all these new social media platforms that are coming up every single day, and still finding ways to like buck against the norm and take up space and kind of find each other and find solace and like safety within each other's voices and presence, like regardless of where we are in America or in the world at large.
Love that. Claire?
Yeah, I think kind of speaking to a similar point of visibility. So for me, I identify as queer and non-binary. And I think that there are two really huge sort of changes that technology has allowed for that are super, super significant for these communities. And I think the first is the idea of visibility, but specifically because of invisibility as sort of a huge roadblock for the queer community historically, right? Like the whole sort of story of queer struggle, especially in the United States, but also globally, has been one of invisibility, right? Like laws that were designed to oppress us were made about alcohol so that they wouldn't actually know that they were oppressing queer people. Like little queer kids are like wondering if there are actually people that think and feel the way they think and feel because maybe they're in like rural communities where they don't have that representation. Like me, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in like a very sort of Christian and somewhat conservative environment. And the first time that I read a book that had like two girls kissing in it, I was like, wait, like that's allowed? Like sign me up, bro. But I think like social media and technology has obviously allowed us to see these things in a totally different light where queer youth aren't sort of subject to that total sense of invisibility, right? Like they're able to find those communities online, even if they can't be out safely to their families. And I think that allows for like a huge sort of shift in the way that queer people discover their identities that makes me very hopeful. The kind of second dimension of that, dealing more with like the non-binary side of things, I think is that on like being online and existing in a virtual space has really transformed, I think, the conversation around pronouns, because I don't like walk down the street with a sign that says that I use she, they pronouns. And that means that like when people encounter me, they're going to rely on their base assumptions. And the shift in the digital landscape to including your pronouns like in your bios, to including your pronouns when you enter a space has changed the way we think about those conversations. When we run into people on the street, all of a sudden it's, hey, you know, if I had this person's Instagram, I would see their pronouns, and maybe the questions are then being asked where when you meet someone, it's not based on your physical assumptions about them. It's based on, hey, I know this is now information to consciously look for. And I think that shift couldn't have happened unless we started having these versions of ourselves that could carry around signs with those sorts of identifiers and like could carry with them on a very intrinsic level that sort of signification. So I feel really hopeful also for a sort of shift in the way we think about gender predicated by just that being a visible marker in the digital space. That also makes me super optimistic.
Awesome.
Yeah, I could certainly talk forever on this question, right? In regards to how I think social media has empowered and disempowered our generation and empowered and disempowered me, right? Personally, in the communities that I identify with, right? I was, as Zaki might remember, right? This, you know, precocious, presumptuous, right, young American Muslim kid who got on the internet and got on stages and decided that my voice demanded to be heard, right? And I found a lot of empowerment and community through social media and through the digital sphere. And I built a nonprofit primarily through social media, right? And built a lot of my identity myself, the people that the communities that I surrounded myself with through the digital sphere. And I used to believe with such an intensity that social media would make the world better, right? Like through expanding our horizons and through more of us connecting with more diverse stories and voices and, through the power of connection and information, the world would look better and brighter. And I used to dream of one day working on Twitter, right? And I really, really thought that social media was a force for good. I regret to inform, right, that sort of a decade later, having studied social media's impact on policy in college, having started a company now, oftentimes leaning into social media, having spent a lot more time in digital spaces, as they've evolved and as they've diversified and as they've complicated, like I no longer share that conviction, right? I'm not optimistic about the future of our digital spaces. And I say that understanding that it's complex, right? And it's not one or the other, right? It's not like social media didn't make the world better. It's that it also made the world worse in a lot of ways, right? It is both of these things at the same time. It is a double-edged sword. And on one hand, I look and I'm so proud, right? And grateful that through the power of social media, right, is really, Zaki, how you know who I am, right? Like, your colleague at the White House, right, who was Bangladeshi and American Muslim, saw my story about me that MTV News wrote and published on social media, and that went really viral within Muslim and Bangladeshi communities. And then I got on your radar and you were gracious enough to host me at the White House on more than one occasion so that my voice as a young person could be included in high-level policymaking conversations around how my community and the communities that I care about are impacted, right, by policy and by politics and by government. And I'm grateful for that. However, right, I'm really concerned, right, about the fact that simultaneously social media propagated misinformation to the extent that it is, in my view, a principal cause of what is happening in Myanmar right now in terms of, right, the genocide that's happening against the Rohingya people in the Rakhine state, right? Insofar as the misinformation that's being spread about people on social media is actively inciting people to violence, right? And so we look at how our community has been simultaneously empowered and harmed. I don't know exactly where I net out, but I know that I net out in a way that isn't optimistic insofar as I think that when social media was first created, it did make the world better insofar as it expanded access to information. It expanded access to community. If you were the only person who looked like you, who loved like you, who prayed like you in your community, you could find someone thousands of miles away and build community and solidarity together. And that was a beautiful thing, right? But every day since then, the algorithms have gotten more perverse to prioritize advertiser over consumer, right? And to prioritize engagement clicks over discourse, right? That we are actually seeing us continually being empowered by new technologies, right? The advent of it made it work better. And we've seen basically like diminishing marginal returns since then, if that might make sense, right? And so I'm not optimistic insofar as I'm really concerned about how people are using anonymized identity to empower and embolden the worst parts about society, right? About how polarized a lot of spaces and places are, such that there's no opportunity to even build empathy and compassion because we're operating from different facts because of how entrenched misinformation is in digital ecosystems and how hard it is to undo, right? And on one hand, I love seeing on my feed that Miss Marvel is coming out, and never did I think in my lifetime that I would see a hijabi Muslim congresswoman, a Palestinian congresswoman sitting, speaking their truth in Congress on my timeline. And never did I think I'd see a Muslim superhero from New Jersey who maybe looked like they could be my sister. And I am damn proud to see that. But simultaneously, we see the most heinous hate speech, right? And the most heinous misinformation that makes us more dangerous. And so I feel complicated and I'm trying to piece through it, but I'm not optimistic.
Yes, great. Thanks for taking us on that roller coaster with you. I think that's
sorry. It is a roller coaster,
and it's a good transition. I mean, that's obviously the next question is, what's the flip side of emerging technology and innovation? I mean, I think Gen Zers are known as being the first sort of like totally digital natives. They sometimes say that about millennials, but I don't really agree with that. So you all are meant to be the early adopters, the ones who understand intrinsically how technology works. But we've also seen the many harms that Ziad has already started outlining, especially when it comes again to different marginalized communities. How do you all feel about that? What are the greatest threats that you're most worried about? Whether it's your own communities or other communities that you've observed. What's out there on the threat horizon?
Yeah, I think I'm certainly worried about my community. I have a little bit more optimism than I think Ziad has in terms of social media and on connecting online, because I think it's not going anywhere, and so we have to find a way to be hopeful. I'm someone who deeply believes in that. But in terms of being worried for my community, I like Clara identify as non-binary and transgender, and what we've seen, right, is kind of like Ziad said, this double-edged sword. We're having a lot more visibility for trans women of color, and that's amazing. But with that visibility comes consequences, right? When people who hate that person see them being emboldened, they, turn to the people in their community and harm, a trans person who has absolutely nothing to do with Laverne Cox starring in Orange is the New Black, but they're so upset that, this person is allowed to live in their full truth and they aren't, that they're then taking that violence out on their local communities and the trans community where they are. I think, what makes me feel hopeful, even though obviously these horrible things are happening, I also know there's severe upticks in violence specifically towards Asian American women and Asian women. I think is the fact that for the first time in a long time, we're having really open conversations, not only in our personal lives, but also at work about these issues, about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I think as an emerging young professional in this field, like there are a lot of companies that for the first time are saying like, oh crap, we need a diversity and inclusion department. We need to make sure that people can bring their full selves to work. And so I think the society is going to catch up. I think that it's going to take a little bit. But I think that, again, I'm cautiously optimistic because I see the young people I see right on this call, who bring me so much hope for that future, because I know that we're all fighting for the same thing.
Yeah, I kind of want to build on Gabe with like this double-edged sort of visibility, because I think that it's something that really speaks to, especially like the queer experience, but also the experience of any Gen Zer that is very behind a cause that, I mean, maybe shouldn't be political. I mean, a lot of these are like very personal. I know we like to say like the personal is political now, but that being said, I think the concern that I feel is it used to be that when you were queer, like you would manage who knew that. And you had very much so total control over that visibility. There was one closet and you were in it or you were out of it. And now there are like 400 closets in 50 different houses in 30 different states. And this feeling, I think, is really challenging because it leaves queer people to do this exhausting calculus all the time where, I'm out at work. I use my preferred pronouns at work, but I'm not out to my family who does have access to the internet and could find my bio for the company. And I think this sort of calculus and the sort of consequences of this visibility mean that even as Gen Zers get to live more authentic truths and get to be their full selves in a way that is broadly more accepting, they're also putting themselves at a huge risk. And I don't think that the digital community has solved this yet. Like, I think you should be able to have your pronouns display differently for different groups of people on social media platforms. I think that this sort of like, there should be more control over your ability to express yourself safely online. And you should have the same amount of control that you have. I think something that's really challenging about online is where you can code switch in real life. You have one online persona, and managing that in a way that feels authentic to yourself without putting yourself in danger is a huge challenge that I think is really aching for someone to solve. Like, I don't know that anyone has figured out how to fix that yet, but I know it's something that really worries me for people that are expressing their political opinions, expressing their identities, in a way that might not be palatable to employers, might not be palatable to their families. And how do we let people use those platforms while keeping them safe? I don't really know. I'm hopeful someone will figure it out, but that's where my concern lies.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Zaki, if I cut you off.
No, it's going to call on you, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I think just to shift slightly, I think a major problem that I've seen, and I was speaking with my friend who was doing her sociology project about like queerness and TikTok. And we kind of found ourselves in a discussion about the commodification of marginalized cultures on these platforms. And that has been such a major issue for me as a Black woman, a Black queer woman who in many ways exists at like the forefront of so many different cultures as far as like our creation and contribution to those cultures, to then see them taken to a platform and minimalized and turned into trends, and then trying to engage in conversations about those trends and stating like, you need to credit dance creators. You need to like look at the slang that you're using and recognize that it comes from Black trans women or just African-American vernacular English, and having those conversations and seeing people say, no, that's TikTok slang. That's Twitter slang. No, this is just a TikTok trend. It's okay that I'm posting a video of me dancing to a Lauryn Hill song with like a tattoo on my arm of Lauryn Hill on my white body, because like, we're all online and we're all engaging in culture. And like the beautiful parts about being on social media is the like this dissemination of culture. And to an extent, I think that is the truth. However, understanding the differences between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation lie almost entirely in respect for these cultural significance and understanding like the long temporality of all these things, and knowing that like TikTok is not like the beginning and end of Black culture or queer culture, or what it means to be a trans person and non-binary person in this country. It is like the like current dot on a very, very long timeline. And that has been kind of the largest issue for me, is seeing the ways in which the like ways that I have partaken in culture throughout my life and been like mocked or demeaned for that participation. And then seeing people being celebrated on these platforms while also simultaneously not acknowledging the roots of these things, or seeing the ways in which, you know, especially like white cis men can kind of like take aspects of like queer aesthetic and wear them and profit from them, and then turn around and kind of like offhandedly say that they were inspired by Marsha P. Johnson, and like not really receive any pushback against that, because now in a way like TikTok is seen as a sort of like cultural bastion, when in reality like it did not, like none of this is new, and like none of these dances are even new. They come from like Triller and predominantly Black platforms, and like people like on the ground dancing and like finding community and comfort within each other and creating culture because of that, as opposed to kind of like creation for an app, which is what it has been today. And I think in a way, a lot of young people, especially people that are younger than me, like 14, 15-year-olds coming into contact with this content, or like my sister that's 11, are kind of remiss in not understanding kind of the background and history of the like content and the cultures that they're engaging with on the platform. And that does make me a little bit worried for like, if this is where we are now, what will this look like in 10 years from now? Like how minimalized will these cultural practices be?
Yeah. So we have a little bit of time left, and this is a fascinating conversation. I wanted to maybe close with maybe a slightly more practical question, which is, you know, we're here, this whole Inclusion Summit is, you know, focused on driving change, especially I think when it comes to the tech industry, when it comes to policymaking and things like that. I know that all of you do work with tech industry, with media companies, and, you know, you are called upon regularly and perhaps sometimes exploited for your perspective on your generation. I guess my question is, what is sort of the number one thing that you think, let's say the tech industry specifically, needs to do or change when it comes to engagement or the centering of Gen Zers? The one thing that the tech industry needs to do. Yeah, go ahead, Ziad.
So I'm not concise, so I apologize in advance. But one thing I would say is it's not one thing, right? Like it's not one thing, because this is such a complex problem that affects so many marginalized and vulnerable communities, right? And I think both government and the tech community, and I think individuals on these platforms all have a role to play in hopefully building a better digital ecosystem for all of us, right? And I think that what I would say is that I think it starts with, but if you're wanting to center diverse young voices on the platform, like listen to them as in decision makers, right? Like we should have vice presidents who look like the communities that are trying to be served in real time at these companies if we want to serve these communities, right? And that's like why Juke Consulting exists and why we do the work that we do. But I think beyond that, from a more functional landscape, like the biggest problem that I have with the tech industry with Silicon Valley right now is the conflation of innovation and progress. But it's this idea that just because something is new and interesting, that means that it makes the world better. Right? And I think it gets us into a lot of traps. It means that the technology that we are building does not actually serve us because of a presumption that it will inherently serve us, right? And so right now we are in a critical moment, right? Where tech companies are making a big pivot towards Web3. Right? And on one hand, Web3 presents wonderful opportunities of attribution, right? To Faith's point around the fact that so much of culture has been co-opted, has been stolen, has been exploited through blockchain technology, and through attribution, we can perhaps protect that more so. The people can own the trend that they created and profit off of that in perpetuity, as they should, right? For being the cultural originator of something digitally, right? On the other hand, Web3 creates a lot of really perverse realities of the winners of Web3 and cryptocurrency are already pre-decided by those who had the liquid capital, right? And the risk appetite to already invest at a very early time, which entrenches systemic inequality because it wasn't marginalized communities who invested, right? It wasn't those, right, who couldn't afford to take that risk who invested, right? And so that has inherently already created an imbalance in who is creating these technologies, because it's not looking like the communities who need to be served. Right? And those who are profiting off of it are not looking at the communities who need to be served, right? And then on top of that, when we think about the metaverse, when we think about these technologies, they allow for even more perverse forms of anonymized identity, right? Where you can cosplay and costumize as whatever you want to be. And we are just now getting to a point in society where I can show up here as an American Muslim, and all of us can show up here as our full selves, right? With whatever identities we might share, and claim our stories, our identities, our baggage with pride, only to create digital humans and digital stories that are completely fabricated when we're not still listening to the real people who matter. Like, I don't need, in my view, a digital avatar to tell me about their trauma when we still have real people that we're not listening to when it comes to their trauma, right? And I don't need an infinite Times Square where people can market to me in a digital landscape when I'm already trying to get limits on my phone, so I'm on it less. So are we creating technologies that people actually want? And are the people creating them the people that we're actually trying to serve, right? And I think we're in a critical moment where we ought to be asking that question by having voices like these in the room, right? By empowering them and by willing to take risks, right? That might not always be good for business, but there's a lot bigger things at stake than business. When we look at the mental health crisis that's happening among young people in this world, when we look at climate change, like I think the air that we breathe, right? And the hearts that we have matter a lot more to me than whether a business thrives. And we ought to be having that conversation in real time. I don't think those in Silicon Valley are.
Yeah, I think I kind of want to like expand on something Ziad said and then also a little bit disagree with part of it. I think so. I am now an English major, but I used to be a statistics major. So I'm going to try to speak to that, and it might be a little imperfect. But there is a phenomenal book called Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin. And what this book talks about is the idea of algorithms and how they're harmful to marginalized communities. One of the really big examples that she draws upon is broken windows policing and the idea that our current police algorithms are based on patterns of police data that were created when police officers who had their personal biases were creating the data sets that would later be used to inform so-called like objective algorithms. And I think that although the impact of that is a little bit more straightforward and we can understand why that would be racist and harmful, I don't think that we're applying those same lenses to the algorithms that govern our social media platforms. I think that there's this misconception that when we automate things and make them more objective on paper, that means they're actually more objective and actually serve all communities equally. But the reality is, if the data is made by people with biases, then the algorithms themselves are going to be biased. So I think bringing humans back into the process, not over automating, not saying, hey, it's an algorithm, so it has to be more objective, is the only thing we can do to fight back against the idea that the data sets we have are informed by systemic injustice that defines our world. And I think that when we start to evaluate that, when we start to put like human beings back in the decision-making process, and specifically human beings who are representative of the communities we're trying to work for back into the process of evaluating what content we center, that's how we sort of fight back. So I think if there's one thing that tech companies can do, it's understand that like making it objective, making it math doesn't mean it's not racist, doesn't mean it's not homophobic, doesn't mean it's not sexist. In fact, it could be worse because all of a sudden we're just calling those things numbers and we don't have the association that we have with those words that gives us sort of the impetus to actually fight back against those issues.
Thanks, Claire.
I could not agree more.
Excellent. Faith or Gabe, would one of you like to take us out?
Yeah, I sure can. I think, right, what one thing, there's a lot of things that tech companies should do. I'm sure we've all seen The Social Dilemma, right? Like we know how tech companies work. We know that, they have so much data and information on us. And I think that there are a few different things they could do. One interesting idea that's been posed, I think, by a lot of different folks at this point is giving us ownership of the information that companies have on us. I think that like we look at information as an asset, but not an asset online, if that makes sense. We have never had access to own our information online. And so I think if we really want, if a company wants to know about me, like I'm totally willing to sell you my information, but there has to be some sort of more exchange than clicking accept all cookies, right? When I go on a website. I also think, right, social media knows that it's bad for people. Literally, Instagram has internal reports saying that, Instagram is bad for teenage girls because it promotes anxiety, body image issues, all these other issues, because at the end of the day, like social media is performance. And I think that, obviously it's a great connector and tech companies have given us so much in terms of ways for us to, like Ziad said, right, connect with people all around the world. But at the end of the day, like what they need to do is I think specifically protect kids and our communities. We talked right in the session about shadow banning and that sort of thing. And I think like we need stronger kind of protection around, kids and the way that their information is sold and stored online. And also, like Claire talked about, I think there needs to be a really good look at, what algorithms are kind of leading the charge and try and avoid this boiling people and all their complexity and diversity down to a set of numbers or data.
Thank you so much. Faith, actually, any final thoughts on your end too? I want to make sure everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has really done a good job of covering so many different viewpoints. I think the largest thing is just finding better ways of like kind of uniformly attributing content to the people that it came from. I think there is an issue with so much of just like I spoke about, like the commodification of culture, but on like a very small level, like on TikTok, there are so many opportunities for like young Black creatives to have much larger platforms than they have. And you just see so many people talking about like not getting an artist tag on the songs that they've released, or like dance trends that go so viral that like Charli D'Amelio is invited to go on Jimmy Fallon and do a dance that was created by like a 12-year-old Black girl, and having to like push and push and push to have her like recognized for something that brought like so many people to that platform. I think is something that I just would like to see more of, just seeing like the people that are kind of acting as the foundation for so much content on this platform being like formally recognized and having like a through process for having the opportunity to like profit from and like live off of their creativity, which is something so often only afforded to certain demographics of people.
Thank you so much, Faith. Well, Ziad, Gabe, Claire, Faith, thank you all so much for this conversation. This is honestly such an important conversation. And, if there's one thing we could take away, it's that the communities that decisions are being made about should be included in every conversation that's about them, whether it's tech companies, whether it's policymakers, whether it's, all the elite institutions like the Aspen Institute. We need to all be taking better steps to including these perspectives and these voices. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you to HTTP.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, HTTP, for having us. We hope you all enjoyed this session and the rest of the summit, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Wow, what a day. It has been such an honor to be here with you today and to have these important and necessary conversations. Thank you so much for joining us in these discussions about accountability, as well as what strategies are working in communities. From the historical obstacles of accessing reliable internet and getting those digital tools to the language we use around discussing broadband and internet access. I'm so honored to be a part and support these conversations. We have learned so much and also discovered how far we need to go to form a more equitable and digital world for all of us. Thank you again for tuning in. I want to send my appreciation to the community advocates, our policymakers and elected officials, and all our speakers for giving their time today. A very special thank you to our HTTP Latino Influencers live team who have been live tweeting and live Instagramming today's event. Thank you to our HTTP CEO Roundtable members, and especially this year's underwriting partners. To learn more about our work at HTTP, please visit www.httppolicy.org. And as always, make sure to connect with us on social media by following at HTTP_policy. See you next time.